Let us now understand how hybrid custody, using Layer 2 smart vaults works, in its simplest form, to prevent loss and theft of Bitcoin, and other similar altcoins. We can further extend this framework to use additional factors such as hardware tokens, to enable both two-factor authentication, and out-of-band authorization. But understanding hybrid custody in its basic form, is essential to grasp the underlying concepts and core advantages. Once you get this, you can easily extend your understanding to include multiple factors, and more. Also, you need to be familiar with Bitcoin transactions, Bitcoin blockchain, and time locks for transaction outputs, to understand hybrid custody and smart vaults. Please brush up on these concepts if you need to, before proceeding. From now on, the inner workings of hybrid custody will be explained as an interaction between Alice, a hypothetical user, and BitSec, a hypothetical hybrid custody provider. Hereafter, we will refer to BitSec's hybrid custody service as BitSec, to keep it brief. And whenever we say Bitcoin, it is equally applicable to any other similar altcoin. Whenever Alice needs to safekeep Bitcoin, she does not transfer Bitcoin to a personal private key linked address, as is commonly done, but sends Bitcoin to a multi-sig address that requires a signature generated using Alice's private key, and a signature generated using BitSec's designated private key, to unlock and spend from it. This is where the similarity with multi-sig ends, and this is how we remove individual custody from the equation, and prevent you from losing your Bitcoin when your private key is lost or stolen. Coming to the nitty-gritties of hybrid custody, and Layer 2 Smart Vaults protocol. At inception, Alice creates a transaction transferring Bitcoin to a multi-sig address, that requires signatures generated using her private key, and BitSec's designated private key as discussed previously. We call this the deposit transaction. She creates the deposit transaction, but does not yet broadcast it. Next, she creates a provisional transaction, using Smart Vault's provisional transaction template, spending all the funds from the deposit transaction. Please note that the deposit transaction is neither broadcasted nor confirmed yet, and the provisional transaction is spending from an unconfirmed transaction. Alice then sends an unsigned copy of the provisional transaction to BitSec over a secure channel. BitSec then adds the signature generated using the designated private key for Alice to the copy of unsigned provisional transaction received from her, and sends the partially signed provisional transaction back to her. Parallelly, Alice adds the signature generated using her private key to the unsigned provisional transaction, and sends the partially signed provisional transaction to BitSec. At this point, Alice has the partially signed provisional transaction, with BitSec's designated private key generated signature already added to it, and BitSec has the partially signed provisional transaction, with Alice's private key generated signature already added to it. Alice then broadcasts the deposit transaction, completing the Smart Vault setup. Pause here to glance over the setup process one more time, and get a better grasp on the steps involved. All the above steps such as creating deposit and provisional transactions, managing communication with BitSec's hybrid custody service, adding signatures, and creating recovery and termination transactions, can be easily and transparently managed by BitSec's desktop and mobile apps, without any friction to the end user. This makes hybrid custody and Smart Vault setup as simple as signing a regular transaction. Now the Bitcoin is in joint custody, and rest everything is managed using the partially signed provisional transactions, in Alice's and BitSec's possession. As discussed previously, the deposit transaction locks the said Bitcoin in a multi-sig address that requires both Alice's and BitSec's private keys to unlock, thereby enabling joint custody. And the rest of the magic happens through the partially signed provisional transactions, in possession of Alice and BitSec, after the initial setup process. If you recollect from the setup process, Alice has a partially signed provisional transaction, with BitSec's signature already added to it, which she can sign with her private key at will, and broadcast as and when necessary. Similarly, BitSec has a partially signed provisional transaction with Alice's signature already added to it, which BitSec can sign with its private key, and broadcast as necessary. This independence is what guarantees certain outcomes, and protects Alice's Bitcoin. Most transactions on the Bitcoin network provide a single option such as N, or M of N signatures to spend from them. But provisional transactions once confirmed, can be spent as several ways, and these options become available, based on how much time has elapsed, since the provisional transaction was confirmed in a block on the underlying Bitcoin blockchain. For example, Alice can sign, broadcast and spend from the provisional transaction, as soon as it is confirmed, using option 3, and signatures generated using her private key, and BitSec's designated private key by coordinating with BitSec. This option can be used when either Alice's or BitSec's systems are breached and private keys are stolen. Or, Alice can sign, broadcast and spend from the provisional transaction all by herself, using option 1, and the signature generated using her private key, once 1,000 blocks are created on the underlying blockchain, after the block confirming the provisional transaction. This is useful when BitSec has suffered a data loss due to unforeseen circumstances, or has gone rogue, and is not responding to Alice's vault termination requests. Over and above that, if ever Alice's private key is lost, BitSec can sign and broadcast the provisional transaction, and then recover Alice's coins, using option 2 of the provisional transaction. To sum it up, we can see what options of the provisional transaction can be used to recover coins and prevent loss, under various circumstances here. As you can see in this confusion matrix, hybrid custody can help recover your Bitcoin most of the time, except in those highly unlikely situations, where information security is breached on both Alice's and BitSec systems, or when Alice has totally lost access to her private key, and it is presumed stolen, and BitSec's private keys are also stolen. It is worth noting here that, even when BitSec's service is compromised, only coins belonging to those users whose private keys are either lost or stolen are at risk, and it is not a service-wide vulnerability. This is by far the most secure technology protecting Bitcoin and other similar cryptocurrencies as of date. If we compare this simple hybrid custody setup with 2 keys to similar 2 of 3 multi-sig or MPC setups with 3 keys or shards, you will immediately notice how hybrid custody is exponentially better, even with just 2 keys. For example, Coinbase custody uses a 3-key setup, where Coinbase keeps 1 key, you get 2 keys, and Coinbase encrypts and keeps one of your keys with it as backup. In this case, at least 2 keys are needed to transfer the Bitcoin in custody. This is the state of the art in the industry, and the only way to harden this scheme is to increase the number of keys, or use some other off-chain and custodian-enforced policies to gatekeep transactions. But what happens when both of your keys are stolen? Or are lost and are inaccessible due to an accident or incapacitation due to medical reasons? All these edge cases and more are handled easily by hybrid custody setups. Even inheritance planning is a nightmare with current non-custodial setups, which is surprisingly easy with hybrid custody. Last but not the least, it prevents hacks and backdoors in custodian systems from seizing or freezing your Bitcoin. These are all very important drawbacks of the current custody ecosystem, and hybrid custody was specifically developed to mitigate these and more. To make it even better, hybrid custody and smart vaults protocol can be extended to include hardware tokens as additional factors for the user and the hybrid custodian. This enables both two-factor, as well as out-of-band authentication and authorization inside smart vaults. Conceptually, these hardware tokens are similar to hardware wallets, but without any seed or recovery phrase. Since seed or recovery phrases for hardware wallets effectively become one more secret or piece of information that needs to be protected, hardware tokens are devised to provide true out-of-band authentication and authorization. You either have your hardware token or you don't. Physical access is required to sign transactions using these devices, and no information leak can compromise this protection. Over and above that, loss and failure of hardware tokens is already accounted for in Smart Vault's protocol, and does not lead to loss of funds in any way. Let us now understand this fortified version of hybrid custody using Smart Vaults. The setup process is very similar, except that the deposit and provisional transactions have been extended to accommodate hardware token-generated signatures, for added safety and security. Going forward, these extended and fortified versions of deposit and provisional transactions will be referred to as L3 deposit and provisional transactions, to differentiate them from the deposit and provisional transactions we saw just a moment ago. And L3 means level 3, and denotes the level of security this particular version of deposit and provisional transactions offer. At inception, Alice, the depositor, creates an L3 deposit transaction transferring Bitcoin to a multisig address that requires signatures generated using her private key, her hardware token, and BitSec's private key. She creates the L3 deposit transaction but does not yet broadcast it. Next, she creates a L3 provisional transaction using the Smart Vault's L3 provisional transaction template, spending all the funds from the L3 deposit transaction. Please note that the L3 deposit transaction is neither broadcasted nor confirmed yet, and the L3 provisional transaction is spending from an unconfirmed transaction. Alice then sends an unsigned copy of the L3 provisional transaction to BitSec. BitSec then adds the signature generated using its private key to the copy of unsigned L3 provisional transaction received from Alice, and sends the partially signed L3 provisional transaction back to Alice. Parallelly, Alice adds the signature generated using her private key, and the signature generated by her hardware token, to the unsigned L3 provisional transaction, and sends the partially signed L3 provisional transaction to BitSec. At this point, Alice has the partially signed L3 provisional transaction, with BitSec's private key generated signature already added to it, and BitSec has the partially signed L3 provisional transaction, with Alice's private key and hardware token generated signatures already added to it. Alice then broadcasts the L3 deposit transaction, completing the extended and fortified L3 Smart Vault setup. Now the Bitcoin is in joint custody as seen before, and rest everything is managed using the partially signed L3 provisional transactions, in Alice's and BitSec's possession. As mentioned already, the L3 deposit transaction locks the said Bitcoin in a multi-sig address that requires signatures generated using both Alice's and BitSec's private keys and Alice's hardware token to unlock, thereby enabling joint custody, as well as out-of-band authentication. This has many advantages, but most importantly, no information breach can ever lead to loss of funds from this transaction, as physical access to depositor's hardware token is needed to unlock the same. As discussed previously, Alice has a partially signed L3 provisional transaction, with BitSec's private key generated signature already added to it, and BitSec has a partially signed L3 provisional transaction with Alice's private key and hardware token generated signatures already added to it. Either party can fully sign the respective partially signed L3 provisional transactions in their possession, without depending on the other, and broadcast a fully signed and valid L3 provisional transaction when necessary. Now even these L3 provisional transactions once confirmed, can be spent as several ways, and these options become available based on how much time has elapsed since the L3 provisional transaction was confirmed, in a block on the underlying Bitcoin blockchain. For example, you can spend from an L3 provisional transaction as soon as it is confirmed, using option 8, and signatures generated using Alice's private key, Alice's hardware token, and BitSec's private key. This option requires Alice and BitSec to cooperate and transfer funds from the provisional transaction. Or, Alice can spend from the L3 provisional transaction all by herself, using option 2, and signatures generated using her private key and hardware token, without any dependence on BitSec, as soon as 1,000 blocks are created on the underlying blockchain, after the block confirming the L3 provisional transaction. As we will see shortly, these L3 provisional transactions enable Alice and/or BitSec to recover funds in spite of stolen and/or lost factors such as private keys and hardware tokens. Let us now understand how hybrid custody secures Alice's Bitcoin when her private key is lost or stolen. Alice creates a recovery transaction transferring respective Bitcoin to a secure address, using option 3 of the L3 provisional transaction, requiring signatures generated using BitSec's private key and Alice's hardware token. She then sends the unsigned recovery transaction to BitSec. BitSec then adds the signature, generated using its private key, as required by the option 3 of the L3 provisional transaction, to the recovery transaction and sends the partially signed recovery transaction back to Alice. At this point, BitSec also adds the signature, generated using its respective private key, to the respective partially signed L3 provisional transaction in its possession, with Alice's signatures already added to it, and broadcasts the same to the Bitcoin network. Once the L3 provisional transaction is confirmed, Alice adds the signature generated using her hardware token to the partially signed recovery transaction received from BitSec, and broadcasts it to the Bitcoin network, as soon as 1,500 blocks are created on the underlying blockchain, after the block confirming the L3 provisional transaction. Recovery process is complete once the recovery transaction is confirmed on the Bitcoin network. You might be wondering how hybrid custody handles failure or loss of hardware tokens, as these do not have any backup or recovery phrase like hardware wallets. Let us now understand how CoinVault secures Alice's Bitcoin when her hardware token is lost or malfunctioning. Alice creates a recovery transaction, transferring the respective Bitcoin to a secure address, using option 9 of the L3 provisional transaction, requiring signatures generated using Alice's private key, BitSec's private key, and BitSec's hardware token. She then sends the unsigned recovery transaction to BitSec. BitSec then adds the signatures generated using its private key and hardware token, as required by option 9 of the L3 provisional transaction, to the unsigned recovery transaction received from Alice, and sends the partially signed recovery transaction back to her. At this point, BitSec also adds the signatures generated using its respective private key to the respective partially signed L3 provisional transaction in its possession, with Alice's signatures already added to it, and broadcasts the same to the Bitcoin network. Once the L3 provisional transaction is confirmed, Alice adds the signature generated using her private key to the partially signed recovery transaction received from BitSec, and broadcasts it to the Bitcoin network, completing the recovery process. Finally, let us assume BitSec is breached, and all the data inside its systems is stolen. So its private keys, and partially signed L3 provisional transactions from all its customers, are now in the hands of the adversary. Now, all that the adversary can do is sign the partially signed L3 provisional transactions with BitSec's respective private keys, broadcast them, and hope that BitSec or its customers do not recover the Bitcoin from these transactions, using options 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 8 or 9, and he can spend from the L3 provisional transaction, using option 6, requiring just BitSec's private keys, once 3,000 blocks are created after the block confirming the respective L3 provisional transactions. However, BitSec and other monitors continuously monitor the Bitcoin network for L3 provisional transactions created through it, and alert the respective parties as soon as any L3 provisional transaction created by them is broadcasted. This enables Alice and BitSec to cooperate and recover the Bitcoin, using options 1, 3, 5, 8, or 9 of the L3 provisional transaction. Even in the unlikely scenario that Alice is unable to communicate with BitSec, she can still recover the funds all by herself, using option 2, and signatures generated using her private key and hardware token, once 1,000 blocks are created after the block confirming the respective L3 provisional transaction. All this ensures that no information breach can ever result in loss of funds from smart vaults. This also removes the incentive to breach any hybrid custody provider's security by adversaries in the first place. To sum it up, here we can see what options of the L3 provisional transaction can be used to recover funds and prevent loss under various circumstances. As you can see in this matrix, hybrid custody using smart vaults can help recover Alice's Bitcoin most of the times, except in those few highly unlikely situations where both private keys and hardware tokens are lost by either or both parties, and information security is breached. It is worth noting here that, even in those rare circumstances, only funds belonging to those customers who have lost both their private keys and hardware tokens are vulnerable, and it is not a BitSec-wide vulnerability. Also, hybrid custody using smart vaults can be customized by modifying the deposit and provisional transactions to handle other contingencies as needed. All the relevant documents, explanatory videos, and details are available on our website, coinvault.tech. And please feel free to reach out to us, and we will be more than happy to discuss all the intricacies and prospects with anyone who is interested in this tech. Thank you.